Hello everyone! Welcome to the Packet Hacking Village at DefCon 29. Here we are again, and it's great to be back. Yeah, it's pretty nice to check out the green screen again. We're going to get started right away with a very special talk. We're going to have the luminary, Dr. Paul Vixie, with the war for control of DNS encryption.
Hello and welcome. I am Paul Vixie. I am here to talk about the war for control of DNS encryption, by which I mean the war for control of DNS, by which I mean the war for control of the internet. I've been talking about this for a couple of years now, responding to investments that have been made by various parties who have a lot to gain or lose, depending on how all of this goes. So I'll try to break it up a little bit, give you some information you may not have heard before if you've seen some version of this talk elsewhere. So first, let me just say that pervasive monitoring is a threat, and it doesn't matter who's doing it. It could be a government agency, some kind of a so-called black agency. Maybe their budget isn't as well overseen. It could be a foreign government, could be a surveillance capitalist, could be your ISP. There are an awful lot of parties out there who want to see what's going on, and their motives are not all aligned with ours as end users. In fact, their motives are not all aligned with the motives of the other parties. So what we're seeing is kind of some high-stakes investments being made by people for whom the control of their own operating conditions is paramount. And again, that may or may not be aligned with each of our interests as end users of the internet. So here's a history lesson. Back in the 90s, when we first started to commercialize and privatize the internet, it had been used almost entirely by government contractors, by and large universities or think tanks, that kind of thing. And it was full of technologists. There was no spam because there were not yet any commercial users of that network. And that led to the current state of affairs, where the whole internet is kind of an escaped science fair project, does not have a lot of resiliency. And every year we complicate it further by trying to work around features that probably should have been there in the beginning. But in fairness, had they tried to put all of that in at the beginning, there would have been no beginning, or perhaps an infinite beginning and no actual internet. Either way, trade-offs were made. We're living in the resulting times. So back in those days, we all ran our own DNS servers, both for the publication of content, so-called authority servers, and also the access of content belonging to others, which are called recursive servers. And in this talk, I'm going to focus almost entirely on the recursive servers, because that's where the war's being fought. But I do want to point out that answers come in to the authority servers and questions come into these things at the bottom called stub resolvers. And they meet in the middle. Right? The question will bubble up. The recursive server will say, I see what you're trying to do there. I either have a copy in my cache, in which case it's a very rapid answer, or I don't, in which case it's got to go surf around, try and find it. So it's a less rapid answer, still very fast, still fast enough to enable the web to come into existence and to progress to this day. So we used to put an IP firewall around our networks. I know a lot of people think that should be passé, but it's not. But it used to be that IP firewall would say, look, if you're going to make a DNS request, that leaves the network, that request really has to be coming from the network's well-understood recursive DNS servers. We don't want other so-called rogue, sort of do-it-yourself recursive servers, because there may be some monitoring or some policy or filtering that we really want to have done. And again, this is in the context of universities, think tanks, that kind of thing. These are enterprise networks before the first ISP. This firewall also kept your recursive server from being accessed by others outside, which was good, because if they could cause you to participate in a DDoS. And I realize DDoS today is a largely commercial activity done for hire or for ransom. But back in those days, it was done for the lulz. So you still wanted to prevent it, but the stakes were not quite what they are. But that's the traditional architecture. 3-layer hierarchy, stub resolvers at the bottom, authority servers at the top, caching recursive full resolvers in the middle, and a firewall. So we don't have that anymore, and it's instructive, I think, to figure out why we don't have that anymore. So after we added ISPs, this was the general topology. There was, as then, or then as now, internet, usually written as a cloud with a big I in the middle. And your ISP had a connection to that internet and had the job of connecting you to that internet. And, so your users and applications would, be connected somehow or other to a local area network, Ethernet, Wi-Fi, that kind of thing. Yeah, we had Wi-Fi even then. And that went to some kind of campus, or maybe it was just your building. But either way, there's usually more than one LAN connected to an ISP, although truly small companies might have had just one. This kind of worked, and this kind of explains why you would want your recursive DNS server to be on your campus, or perhaps in your ISP, or perhaps on your LAN, which is you want to keep it close. You don't want to depend on something far away that may be helping you reach something that is not far away. And again, these were innocent times. So, money is power, and power changes everything. And once the internet started to become important to global commerce, then a lot of different parties said, okay, if it's going to be important, I want my piece of it. I want to sort of place myself in the flow of all that money and all that power. And there were any number of times when somebody saw opportunity in the Ferengi sense and did something that would be good for them and maybe not as good for everyone else. And so if you're old enough, you're going to remember the SiteFinder debacle. Now, SiteFinder was a relatively innocent company. They just sold ads. But the way it was deployed was kind of blamed on them, and it wasn't really them. It was VeriSign. VeriSign was operating the .com top-level domain then, as they do today. And they one day decided on their own recognizance, without recourse to the IETF or the regulator or anybody, that they would put a wild card into .com. And if there's a wild card at a name, that means you cannot answer negatively. Everything that anybody asks for will appear to exist. And this is pretty dangerous and pretty useless, and you're not going to see very many active uses of it today. And this was kind of alarming back then. The wildcards were seen to have their place. This was not that place. And what it meant was if the name that you were looking for in .com existed, you would get a real answer. If the name didn't exist, then you would get an answer that pointed you at SiteFinder. And VeriSign and SiteFinder agreed to share the resulting revenue from all of the ads that would be then displayed. This wouldn't have been possible in a pre-web era, because giving somebody the address of advertising server wouldn't help very much if what they were doing was Gopher or FTP or email or any of the other pre-web protocols. Anyway, there's a big big debacle around that, lawsuits and so forth, and it was eventually settled and the wild card disappeared. But it shows what I mean when I say there was a war for control of DNS. Today it's DNS encryption. Then it was DNS in general. Now in 2005, OpenDNS came into existence, and they said, yeah, we're going to move the recursive server very far from your LAN, from your campus. We're going to do it very far from your ISP. And it won't be too far, it'll be fast enough. But won't you be glad that you've got one global service for this instead of having every ISP make their own? Well, no, we weren't. But, a lot of newcomers came in. They didn't realize that this was kind of a power grab. And so they participated, and eventually OpenDNS did what a lot of companies did. They looked for a business model. And they tried the same thing VeriSign had done, except this time they weren't doing it with a wild card. They did it simply by refusing to answer negatively to any question. So this was bigger than just .com. This was all names. And there was a lot of complaints. And there was opt-in, there was opt-out, there was a bunch of different things. But the other thing they did was to say, yeah, so there's this Google company, and they got this big search engine, and we think that's good, we think that's important. So we're going to have a search feature also. We're going to have it be that if you ask OpenDNS about www.google.com, you're going to get the address of a search page at OpenDNS itself. Now, OpenDNS didn't have a search engine, so all they were doing is data mining those keywords and then sending you a redirect so that you would get the answer from Google. OpenDNS didn't have the answer. But they sure wanted to know what keywords you were interested in so that when they were selling ads that concerned your IP address, which they knew, they could make those ads more relevant to you, right? That's still how we fund the internet. Bit draconian. Anyway, Google said, please stop doing that. Those are our queries. We don't want you to do that. And OpenDNS said, look, you're getting all the data. We're not depriving you of anything. So we're just going to keep doing this. It's not against the law, and you're not being harmed. And Google thought long and hard about that for a few hours maybe, and started work on their own recursive DNS system called 8.8.8.8, which probably gets 1 billion queries a second today. Not sure if OpenDNS would have pursued this strategy if they'd realized that they would simply be pushing Google into competition as they did. But anyway, Google didn't want other companies to be able to data mine those keywords. They're in the advertising business. They did not intend to let their competitors see what they would need to be better at competing. So eventually, because we had all of these servers all over the place, and you could no longer predict where a web browser would be coming from based on where the DNS query had come from, the industry that had sprung up around this created probably the most dangerous DNS protocol enhancement ever. It's called eDNS Client Subnet. And this meant that you could find out, if you were an authority server, where the stub resolver was. Normally you wouldn't know that. You'd only know the address of the recursive server, but that was no longer useful for predicting, for content delivery purposes, for Akamai, for trying to associate your web browser with a nearby mirror of the content. And so now that data was passing through from the stub resolver through the recursive server all the way to the authority server. And as you might expect, that's a big data leak. It is such a horrid privacy infringement that in 1.1, Cloudflare has just decided they will not support it. They may have other reasons in addition to wanting their end users to have more privacy, but a lot of us don't support it. And it is something that you should turn off unless you know a lot more than I'm going to tell you today about what it does and what are the costs and benefits of having and not having it. Then, of course, in 2013, Edward Snowden famously flew to Hong Kong with a bunch of thumb drives and said, look, I've got all this stuff showing all the terrible things that the surveillance facilities of the U.S. government are collecting. And boy, there was a lot of interest in that. Because a lot of people didn't know how the world worked. They didn't know that governments and dirty tricks have always been bedfellows, and that, governments will always do whatever they can possibly do. And generally, governments are staffed by patriots who think they're doing the right thing. So it's easy to say they're, misled or naive or maybe doing the wrong thing by accident. But I hope that generally people don't think that people enter government for the purpose of abusing civil rights. It's just that sometimes patriots reason their way to doing things that folks like Edward Snowden are alarmed about. Anyway, the result was RFC 7258, where the Internet Activities Board said, look, pervasive monitoring is an attack. We have to secure all Internet protocols. We can't let this kind of thing go on. And, what I want to point out is that all of these are cases where someone either wanted power or wanted someone else to not have power. But it was all about power. So by 2010, the topology was that your recursive DNS was connected to the internet but nowhere near you. And the content delivery networks like Akamai were also connected to the internet, and maybe one or more of them might be near you, but the system had to become adaptive in order that you got good performance, or that the owner of content didn't have to pay a huge amount of money to get it delivered to you, as opposed to the moderate amount of money of just keeping a mirror of that content nearby. So this meant we were sending our DNS queries through an ISP, through the internet, to some distant place, who would then sort of forward the query off to an authority server in a CDN, thus telling the CDN where your DNS query had come from. It drastically expanded the attack surface, and it made everybody less private. It made everything less secure, and it created the conditions that all of the RFC 7258 could talk about. Pervasive monitoring is a result of us putting things far from us that did not need to be far from us. Yeah, we needed crypto, but by that time we had SSL. It was the unencrypted protocols that we needlessly pushed out into the world and then tagged with our IP address for some reason, because of course everybody should trust everybody. That's what created the situation where pervasive monitoring could be abused. Now, in fairness to Edward Snowden, these abuses weren't inevitable. I mean, maybe they are, depending on how you feel about human nature. But the ability to replace a valid negative answer with a positive answer that pointed to an ad server, or the ability to just look at your DNS queries to figure out what you're interested in so that your ads can be tailored for you, that's not something any of us gave permission for. And in fact, if you look at what's happening in Europe with GDPR and e-privacy, that's something that you are now legally required to get case-by-case permission for. But the abuse was inevitable, and it occurred. And so first IETF created something called DNS over TLS. And this is a very straightforward protocol. It just does for DNS what HTTPS did for the web. It just says, let's secure the channel over which web content is carried. And deployment of this is slow, partly because it calls for a different port number, because it wasn't possible to add auto-negotiation in the way that we would have wished. Certainly that happened for IMAP, and SMTP did not happen for the web and did not happen for DNS. But one of the great things about this is that it fits the old model. So where I showed you that firewall, the firewall could still say, look, I can recognize this because of its port number, therefore I can block it. I can have a policy that only my recursive server can get out, and that if you want to reach a recursive server, you're going to have to use the one that's on the inside. So it allowed network operators to have policy. And sometimes those policies were for regulatory reasons or for just corporate risk management reasons or whatever. So there were and still are a lot of private networks. So this model does not fit the public network very well, right? You don't want your ISP to do that generally, because perhaps your ISP is tweaking your DNS responses so that you get more ads, or perhaps they're data mining your DNS queries so they can figure out which ads to send you. So, on a public network where there's an ISP, you really don't want them to have the easy ability to keep you from choosing your own recursive server. And for that reason, among several, the IETF then, a couple of years later, created DNS over HTTPS, which is called DOH, D-O-H. And that's also being deployed, probably more broadly because it has such crowd appeal. Now, this is firewall proof because it lives in HTTPS. It's on the same port number as the Secure Web Protocol. So you really can't easily tell in a firewall whether a given flow is or is not DOH containing, so you can't forbid it. Now, this is good in the case of a public network where you want it to be hard to forbid it, but it's bad in the case of a private network where you really have to be able to forbid it because, you're responsible to your family, if it's family filtering, or to your employees, or to regulators, or to your shareholders, or whatever. So building a ubiquitous, pervasive DNS replacement protocol that is firewall proof is an extremely controversial act. And it's starting to get its feet tangled in the deployment issues around that, because the people who thought that it should just replace everything turned out to be wrong. There are market forces that will prevent it from just automatically working everywhere. I'm irritated that this was a reflex. I think that we could have negotiated a settlement in less time than it has taken to figure out how to deploy these two protocols, which are each only useful to one kind of network. So we're doing that late, and if you do something late, you usually have greater expense. It's better to pay your costs up front. So there have been a number of reactions. I mentioned 7258, and we had the DOT, then DOH, and now most recently 8890. The internet is for end users. And this is where the Internet Activities Board has, at least in the person of one of its members. Other members have sort of disclaimed that, said, wait, that doesn't speak for all of us. Well, okay, you shouldn't have let them put the IAB's name on it in that case. But anyway, what this thing goes on to say is that end users should always be king. And what they want is what the internet should do. Doesn't matter if they're members of a family, maybe minors, maybe employees, maybe customers, maybe bots, botnets. I guess those aren't end users, but they sure look like end users. So anyway, when 8890 came out, I checked myself carefully. Nowhere on my head is there an RJ45 Ethernet jack. And even though I've been vaccinated, I don't think that I can speak the G5 protocol or Wi-Fi or anything else. I don't believe that my brain is going to connect to the internet ever. There's always going to be some piece of hardware that does that. And that piece of hardware is fronting for me. And so when we say the internet is for end users, what we mean is the internet is for browsers. The internet is for the hardware and software that is able to connect to the internet. And sometimes those browsers and software and hardware does what the human understands and what the human wants. Sometimes the human doesn't understand it and wouldn't want it. So when you talk about the internet is for end users, what you're really saying is the internet is for surveillance capitalists. And humans are just along for the ride. We conveniently provide our eyeballs to the experiment. So here's the modern DNS system architecture. I'm very proud of what's on the right side of your screen right now. My team created the RPZ system, which allows policy to be published and subscribed that will affect recursive DNS servers. So if you're an IT administrator and you want to just automatically lie to your botnet, your botted clients, or your infected clients, or your IoT surveillance capitalist devices, you want to lie about advertising servers. If you own a network and you run a server and you want it to lie, there's now a standard protocol by which you can do that. It's called RPZ, and we did that in 2010. And if you want to surveil a client population, you want to find out what is your IoT doing, what are your family members doing, what are your customers doing, what is the Internet of Surveillance Capitalism doing. You can do that too. There's a standard protocol called DNS TAP. My team did that in 2016. So you might observe that I am a long-time builder of DNS things. And what I've been building most recently is things that use the DNS to secure other things, because the DNS is the keys to the kingdom. But of course, being able to lie, being able to surveil are only really appropriate for private networks. There's something your ISP might want to do if the regulator is okay with it or if the regulator demands it. But you probably wouldn't want, the great Chinese firewall to do that. Or the Turkish firewall or the Russian firewall. You probably would like those nation states to not have the same powers that an IT administrator would have. And so these protocols that I helped create with my various teams are a little bit controversial because everybody wants the internet to work for them, to do what they need it to do. And so we each make our own investments in the future operating conditions. Anyway, equally controversially, on the left side of your screen, you have applications doing DNS, ADD. There is an IETF working group called ADD. Does not mean attention deficit disorder. It means apps doing DNS. Mostly that's browsers, but really any IoT device, anything, any app on your PC or Mac or smartphone, anything in your house can use the protocol that it speaks, which is DOH. And if you'll note, it carefully bypasses your firewall because it's completely firewall proof. It's unrecognizable to your firewall, which means anybody on your network, if you let them speak the web without a proxy, they are going to be doing DNS. And they're not going to go through your recursive server. They're not going to be subject to your policy, and you're not going to know what they did. That is a problem. As I said, there are many private networks that need those powers. Everything is so darned insecure that you can't just tell me, you don't need a firewall, just go secure your endpoints. I mean, I can't secure most of the stuff I have. I don't even know what it's doing. I'm using DNS analysis to figure out what I need to secure. How am I going to find out what to secure if it's not going to show me its DNS transactions? So I understand there's a zero corp or beyond corp model, and that in some future everything will be secure down to the endpoint, and we won't have these worries. But I got to live for the next 50 years without that. So do you. So we are going to have to install proxies. We're going to have to say that if you want to speak the HTTPS protocol off network, you're going to have to exchange key and material with a firewall resident device, which will decrypt your request, make sure it fits with policy, fetch for you, pull it in, and decide whether what it's about to give you is, a virus or malware of some kind, and maybe you'd make a decision about not sending it. That's the only thing we've got left if we want to protect ourselves from the vast array of unsecure software and hostile software that is on our networks, not just people, but devices and poison supply chains and so forth. This is going to be ugly. And I predict that we're going to have a protocol where you learn who your proxy is so that you can make an informed decision about whether you trust it. If you're in a coffee shop or a hotel room and you get some message that says, "Nope, sorry, you can't do that, use this proxy," you can make an informed decision. Do I want to use this proxy or not? Like you should for Wi-Fi. And a lot of us just won't, or we'll use a VPN or something else. But that's where this war is going. It's going to an ugly place where a lot of stuff that used to kind of work because it wasn't broadly abused now is going to be taken off the table because it is so broadly defended against. So, I do have a question. Is possession still 90% of the law? I'm responsible for what my network does. If I spam somebody through some botnet, if I DDoS somebody through some botnet, I can expect to be asked about that by at least my ISP, maybe by the victims. Am I just going to say, "I'm sorry, the firewall became irrelevant, I don't have one, and I can't tell which device is going to do what thing because everything is now opaque to me, so you just have to cope with whatever my network does to you"? Am I going to get a free pass on that? I don't expect one. I think I'm going to be held responsible for decisions I can no longer make. But on the web, it's a network of eyeballs. On the internet, it was a network of networks. And it doesn't matter who pays for the network. What matters is that some surveillance capitalist somewhere wants to use it to make money. So right around the year 2000, Larry Lessig famously observed that code is law. And that was true and has become more obviously true ever since. So if you didn't think he was a genius then, go look at what he said and when he said it and realize, yeah, he was a genius then. He's probably still a genius now. You might listen. But trouble is that code is no longer Linux and BSD and a bunch of stuff written by plucky volunteers. Code is now mostly corporate persons and people who work for corporate persons. And so the law is being written not by plucky volunteers who have a vision for the future that includes freedom and autonomy and privacy for everyone. No, we've got code being written by companies who have their own vision of what the future operating conditions for them and their customers ought to be. So Larry was right, but I'm not sure we are going to enjoy how right he was now that it's not a bunch of fun 20-somethings trying to change the world. So in 1990, an open system meant that it could be understood or changed. Now it just means that it's possible to fork it, but you can't actually change a lot of the open systems that are out there. If you don't like the way the Red Hat kernel works or the Microsoft Linux kernel or something like that, you can start the process of trying to convince others to not like it either and accept your patch. But it's not nearly as easy to make a change in the way everybody lives as it was when open source was a new thing. It has been co-opted by larger, older powers. So in the internet era, alignment was negotiable. We had all these gates in between the service on the far end and the user on this end, and any one of them could decide, I don't like what's about to happen, so I'm going to block it. I have a policy, and I forbid this traffic. So just imagine any of these sets of blue lines being moved up or down because that operator or that plug-in or ad blocker or whatever didn't like what they were seeing. That was not good. I mean, it was good for me, but it was not good for commercial investments by surveillance capitalists. So we don't have that world now. And so let me remind you that any discernible pattern, anything that's left after compression or encryption that you can still use to somehow recognize that a given input produced it, is an attack surface. It means that the entropy level is lower than perfect. And so we keep upgrading our encryption and upgrading our compression until the result is just indistinguishable, numerically speaking, from white noise. And that's what we have. That is now fairly easy to do. You don't even need hardware accelerators to do it, right? Cheap little CPUs like the one in my Apple Watch can do full speed encryption, and they are. So this is the world we live in now, the web era. Alignment is forced. Everything will be encrypted from end to end. Nothing in the middle, whether it's a browser or an ad blocker or a client operating system's malware detector, the operator's firewall, the ISP's regulatory regime, the far end ISP's regulatory regime. Nothing matters. We've got services who want an indisputable path to their users. And anything that gets in their way is indication of investments that they should be making but haven't yet. So where are we? Well, DOT, that's the simple thing that's firewall capable, is out there, and it is starting to be used between content servers and recursive servers. But it's difficult because the X509 CA system doesn't really have broad support for using an IP address as a way to decide which key you should be expecting. That's in an RFC, but it's a fairly modern RFC, and there's a lot of code out there that won't work. So we're gradually having to drag a whole bunch of SSL libraries into the future in order to get DOT deployed. But it is working, and it's doing what it's supposed to do. It prevents on-path interference in these protocols. I mean, you can interfere with a firewall, you can block it entirely, but you can't look at it. You can't see what the content was, and you can't perturb it. And that's all it was designed to do. DOH, of course, is designed to have those capabilities, but to be firewall-proof. So, controversially, in Firefox, Mozilla Corporation has decided that they're going to turn on DOH first, just silently. And after it's up and running, then they will produce a pop-up to tell the user, by the way, we just made your internet connection more secure. If you want to go back to the old insecure way, here's the button you can click that will undo what we have already done. Surprisingly, there's not a lot of people who say, I understand this and I don't like it, and so I'm going to opt out. The fact that they have to opt out, the fact that they are presented with this thing that's been done, and by the way, if you want it to stop, you have to opt out, frankly, is what spammers do. And I think that Mozilla Corporation ought to be ashamed of itself. And I've told them this, so they're not going to be shocked when they hear about this video. Now, Chrome, surprisingly, and there's Google out there, they make money this way, but they decided they were going to be a good example. So Chrome does not do that. It will upgrade your connection to DOH if the server that you picked, that your operating system is using, supports DOH. But it will not change where it sends your queries in the way that Firefox will do. Firefox chooses a new DOH server for you, as opposed to just trying to find out if DOH would work with the server you picked for yourself, which is what Chrome does. And so far, the other Chromium forks like Brave and Edge have done kind of the same thing. Windows is going to start using DOH OS-wide, so then some DLL somewhere is going to be updated, maybe has been updated, to just use DOH if it will work. But again, it will not choose a different DNS server for you, so it's not changing your policy or the visibility of your information. It's just changing how secure it will be to access the server you've picked. iOS and macOS can certainly use DOH system-wide, but they can also have an application sort of opt-in. They can decide that if the operating system isn't using it, but some app wants to use it, then the app can ask permission. And that's in keeping with Apple's general philosophy of asking users permission about stuff. There is a protocol out there called MDM, which is used by enterprises who can afford big IT departments. And that has some bits in it about DOH. And so that, I guess, would stop Firefox from turning on DOH and selecting your server for you. But, that's the barn is burnt by the time you're doing that. MDM is way too expensive for me to use at home or for most small enterprises to use. So, everybody reacted to this differently. I do want to say Russia famously said, yeah, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do any of that. We will upgrade the firewalls between the Russian economy and the rest of the world so that none of this works. We expect China to do the same. Somewhere in the middle of this, Comcast sued Google about DOH. And what Comcast said is, look, we're both in the ad business, we're competitors, and Comcast wants to see what its users are looking up in the DNS. And Google is preventing us from seeing that. Therefore, we can't be as good an advertiser as Google is. I'm not sure Comcast wanted to get out there and talk about what they do in quite such bold and broad terms. They settled that lawsuit. I don't know who paid whom. But it is interesting that the people who are in business understand what DOH is for. Apple did something that was controversial last year. They said, we don't think our apps ought to be subject to the firewall choices that the user makes. Our apps need to be able to reach the Apple corporate mothership, period, full stop. And so they just, I guess, used some underlying technology in the mock kernel to just bypass the IP layer that was stopped by the firewall. This caused a little snitch to stop working, at least for Apple's own apps. Now, Apple changed their mind, and they said, yeah, okay, we didn't realize everybody's going to complain quite that much. We'll take that back out. But they demonstrated that it's up to them, not us, what our own devices that we thought we owned are going to do in terms of firewall policy. They can change their mind again, and they will. Either because they care about some market, some economy that has a stronger regulatory regime, or because they just eventually figure, okay, we'll try it again, and this time we hope the world's ready for it. I'm not sure I like having corporate policy deciding how my devices are going to work. So I do have a few Apple devices, but I expect them to dwindle over time. Also interesting is something called QUIC, Q-U-I-C, and that is moving the web out of TCP/IP altogether and making it use UDP, which is connectionless and therefore stateless. And it will be very encrypted, very firewall proof. And, this is all a response to RFC 7258 about pervasive monitoring and RFC 8890 in response to the internet is for end users. But I do want to point out that your antivirus program currently lives as a hook in your operating system's TCP connection primitive. And so when the kernel is asked to open a connection, your antivirus gets a chance to decide, is that a good idea or a bad idea? Well, with QUIC, that hook won't fire. So this is disintermediation technology. And they're not, very few people working on it are fully cognizant of how many parties are going to be disintermediated by it. I think the thought is that disintermediation is good. It doesn't matter who the middleman was. And that's just not true. And I would point you again to your IoT devices, your children, your customers, your employees. You should secure everything you can, but that doesn't mean you should run bare-ass naked through the woods. So, this is inevitable. We cannot stop this from happening. We can try as much as possible to educate people about what's coming, and we can try to build better systems that are more attractive and see if we can attract interest in a more secure operating mode. But genie's not going back in the bottle here. So we are going to live in a future that has got far less understanding or control by anyone except the makers of browsers and the makers of servers. And you can decide whether that is alloyed or unalloyed good. Finally, getting back down to the end here, you got to contextualize the information age. It used to be that if you dominated on land, you dominated. And then sea came along, and it turned out you could dominate on land and still get your ass kicked by people operating at sea. And then those people got their ass kicked by folks who could operate in the air. And so on. Those people got their asses kicked by folks who could operate in space. I don't mean space lasers, I just mean the ability to see what's going on everywhere from such a high angle that secrets can't be kept. Well, now it's information. And if you dominate the sphere of information operations, you will kick the asses of any previous domain. And information superiority is not, it's not a government activity. The governments do a lot of stuff there, but whereas you had to be a government to be early in space or to have airborne munitions or seaborne munitions or landborne munitions, you do not have to be a government to be the most powerful force in information on the planet. You do have to be a corporate person. It's something that a random movement of millions of open source advocates can do something. We can disrupt, and certainly BSD and Linux did that. But other than stuff like that, the actual coherent use of information operations force will be done by corporate persons. And that's where we be. So do keep in mind this complexity thing. The more that is going on inside of your network or your PC or your smartphone or whatever, the more complicated it is. And if you install some new thing on your network or some new software on your computer that you don't understand, you're probably making your situation worse, right? There have been all kinds of 0 days in firewall technology itself, where because you had that firewall, you were actually less protected once somebody knew that there was a way to bypass it. So I encourage you to study this slide and think about Q. If you're going to make an increase in the number of devices or technologies that you have, please try to offset it with an accompanying increase in your understanding. And if you can't, then try to offset it by turning off older stuff, ripping out older stuff. Try and keep your understanding relative to the whole roughly constant. Because in all cyber war, every time we've got attackers and defenders, whichever side understands the attacked technology better, it comes out on top. Understanding predicts your risk. Complexity, therefore, predicts your risk. And I wanted to bring that up because we're about to drastically increase the number of things that no one understands. I thought you might not believe me about Russia, but it's a thing. It's a real thing. Now, at that time, they meant encrypted server name indicator, ESNI. That's been renamed. It's now called Encrypted Client Hello, because ESNI did not encrypt enough. Now they're encrypting the whole thing. And I understand why. If you look at what Edward Snowden reported, we've got to do something to protect ourselves. But I think we can't just say governments no longer have a role, because as you see here, they do. I think we're going to need a negotiated solution, and these are just the early moves in a very long game. And we're not going to see sort of total war by all parties, because you can't make money that way. So we're going to end up negotiating, and we should have started that way. So the game is that if you want to control your operating conditions, you've got to do surveillance, prediction, and control. And when I say surveillance, I mean observation, but specifically the observations you can do that people don't know you can do. So these are the surreptitious observations. And you do your surveillance, you update a model, you do your predictions based on that model, update the model again, and you do your some controls. You try and move stuff, right? Retail shopping, for example, often moves milk to the back of the store so that you walk by other stuff. They didn't do that randomly. They analyzed the patterns. They predicted what you would do, and then they arranged for what you needed to do to be of greater benefit to themselves. That's happening 1 trillion times a day in the e-commerce world. Everybody is gathering as much information as they can. They're predicting as much behavior as they can, and then they're controlling that to their own best advantage. That game won't change. What will change is what they can see, what you can see, what they can predict, what you can predict. I would like you, as a real person, not a corporate person, but a real person hearing my voice, I'd like you to have more privacy, more lived autonomy, where your choices have not been managed for you by entities far more powerful and long-lived than yourself. And that's not going to happen if everybody continues to just knee-jerk, let's encrypt everything because Snowden. Please put some thought into that. Also, if you don't like the protocols, go out and make some of your own. There are some working groups in the IETF. You should join them. You should take a look at this and see what you can contribute to that debate. This is me. This is how you find me. I have a day job. I'm on social networking. I've been around doing DNS and internet stuff for 30 some years. So you may have heard of me or maybe running some of my software. Sorry about the bugs, but thank you very much for your time today.
Wow. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you for your continuing support of the Packet Hacking Village. This is Paul's second time at the Packet Hacking Village, and very grateful for your contributions to not only to the internet that we know of today, but also to our village. I'm very grateful for your contributions. Thank you. So, one thing before we get to the next talk, which starts at 10 o'clock Pacific time, want to spend a few minutes to talk about the Packet Hacking Village, what we are and what we do. So, the Packet Hacking Village has been a mainstay at DefCon for many, many years. A lot of people know the Packet Hacking Village as the infamous home of the Wall of Sheep. To make a long story short, especially for people who are brand new to DefCon, the Packet Hacking Village has the main mission is security education. And we accomplish that mission by way of hands-on trainings, unorthodox methods. One year we had a booth that monitored network traffic and what it means to have to be using the internet insecurely. And also now we also use talks as well. This year is a little bit special. This year is a little bit special because we tried to focus our talks on the fundamentals, the bread and butter. So a majority of the talks for the Packet Hacking Village at DefCon 29 is focused on core fundamentals, things like DNS, things like the different protocols, as you'll see with Roy next with the Internet Protocol. Um, Logs. Like, those are the bread and butter stuff. Yeah, we can talk about all the fancy hacks and 0 days and all that stuff, which attracts a lot of attention in cybersecurity, but it's going to be hard to really understand what's going on if you don't have a good grasp of the fundamentals. Um, and one of the things that this is, I've lost count of how many years I've been involved with the packet hacking village. Um, but one of the things that why I'm still with the packet hacking village up to this day is because of our not only our focus on the fundamentals, but also it's an environment where we welcome everyone. Um, and with that being said, for those of you, if this is your very first DefCon, whether it's virtual, whether it's in person, welcome. Welcome, make yourself a home, enjoy our activities, enjoy the day and the weekend. Learn and gather as much as you can. Please. Uh, Eat up the opportunities that you have. And now I would like to say, even with DEF CON being both remote and both in person this year, um, I feel there's even more countless opportunities for people to learn. Enjoy DEF CON, enjoy the Packet Hacking Village, and in a few minutes we will go with Roy Fang talking about the Internet Protocol. Okay, folks, just for the time being, I just want to let everyone know that I'm going to stop the stream for a few moments, um, hopefully to have something be taken into effect. So I'm going to stop it, and it'll be back up in like 30 seconds.